Hey there, this is Krisha again, and welcome back to my channel on how to analyze research papers. Before we get started, remember to like and subscribe so you can get notifications for all of my future videos. And without further ado, let's get started. So in this video, I wanted to look at this article, Signs and Symptoms to Determine if a Patient Presenting in Primary Care or Hospital Outpatient Settings has COVID-19. Obviously, COVID is still a pretty big problem in the US and in many places around the world, even though it is getting better and restrictions, at least where I am, are easing. But I thought this is probably important to address now because we are also hearing more reports in the US of the Delta variant spreading. So yeah, let's take a look at this article and let's analyze the abstract in this video. So clearly this article is going to be about possible signs and symptoms of COVID-19 and how that can help with diagnosis of COVID-19 and how accurately symptoms can predict the presence of COVID. And that's kind of what is covered in the background here as well. They do say that the clinical implications of SARS-CoV-2 are highly variable, and some people with the infection don't have any symptoms at all, while others can have mild to moderate symptoms and pneumonia. And then they give some examples of what some symptoms might be, like fever, cough, loss of smell or taste, signs of oxygen saturation, and these are some things that are more easy to diagnose. So these are some of the things they're going to most likely be looking at throughout the study. So then they go on to list their objective here, and remember all of these sections are a part of the abstract. So let's see what the objective here is. It says it is to assess the diagnostic accuracy of signs and symptoms to determine if a person presenting in primary care or to hospital outpatient settings, such as the emergency department or dedicated COVID-19 clinics, has COVID-19. So yeah, as we were saying from the title as well, this article's objective is basically to look at the signs and symptoms of COVID and see how accurately that can predict the presence of COVID. And then they list some search methods. So to gather data here, they undertook electronic searches in the Cochrane COVID-19 Study Register and the University of Bern Living Search Database. And they also tracked repositories of COVID-19 publications. So all of these they got from, say, online sources, from studies that have already been done in the past. So that means these are all secondary sources. Many studies will also use primary sources, which means, for example, like a primary search method, primary source search method in this case with COVID might be the researcher actually going out and going to a COVID clinic maybe and gathering data, seeing what signs and symptoms different patients there are presenting, gathering the data, and then also seeing which of those patients actually had COVID. So that's not what they did here, though. These are all secondary sources that they've used, things that are already perhaps available online from past primary source searches. And then how did they pick what studies they were going to use and what data they were going to analyze from all these different online publications and different sources that they found? So they said that here studies were eligible if they included patients with clinically suspected COVID-19, or if they recruited known cases with COVID-19 and controls without COVID-19. So basically, if people were either known to have COVID or suspected of having COVID, as well as controls without COVID, were all included in the study. And they also looked at studies in hospitalized patients who presented symptoms of COVID when they were being admitted. On the other hand, they do say that if people contracted COVID while they were in the hospital, then they were not eligible for the study because it's clear then that they probably contracted COVID, maybe from another person in the hospital. Okay, so that makes sense. They defined their selection criteria here. And then the next step here is data collection and analysis. So take a minute to read through this and then we'll just go over it real quick. So essentially what they're saying in this section is that two authors were picked to independently assess different factors like risk of bias in all the studies. And then a third review author, was there to essentially mediate any disagreements. And this team of three authors helped to select the studies that were going to be used for this analysis. Then they go on to say that we presented sensitivity and specificity in paired forest plots, in receiver operating characteristic space, and in dumbbell plots. So those are different ways in which they analyze the data, different types of plots. But what is the sensitivity and specificity data that they're talking about? So sensitivity essentially refers to the number or the accuracy of a particular test in diagnosing how many people did have a specific disease. So in this case, a high sensitivity would mean that a specific test or like a specific symptom was accurate at predicting the presence of COVID. Specificity is kind of the opposite. It's saying that it measures how accurate a test was at confirming the lack of a certain disease. So in this case, if say someone was asymptomatic, does that mean that for sure they don't have COVID? Or if most people who are asymptomatic do not have COVID, that would mean there's a high specificity. Whereas if there are a lot of people who are asymptomatic and do still have COVID, and basically if that doesn't predict the presence of COVID well, then there's a low specificity. So that's kind of the difference between sensitivity and specificity there, and that is what they are going to be analyzing. And then they explain their results here. In the first two paragraphs over here, they kind of define some potential, for example, they say high risk of bias here, some potential problems in the study. Basically, they're just saying, like, take this study with a grain of salt, as you would really with any research paper. They're essentially using 44 studies, and prevalence of COVID-19 varied from 3% to 71%. So it's a very, very large range. And they used studies from primary care settings, outpatient testing centers, hospital outpatient wards, hospitalized patients, emergency department, and other unspecified settings. And all of their COVID-19 cases are presented together, and they aren't split into like mild, moderate, severe. Okay, that's what the first paragraph says. In the second, as I said before, they are talking about some things you might need to watch out for with the results. Take it with a grain of salt, because some studies did have a high risk of bias. In others, they were unable to assess the risk for selection bias, as they say over here. And this might influence sensitivity for things such as fever and cough. Then they go on to actually present their data. So results did vary quite a lot, and only cough and fever had a pooled sensitivity for at least 50%. So most of them had quite low sensitivities then. And that would mean they weren't very accurate at really predicting the presence of COVID-19. They also talk about other things like anosmia and ageusia. I don't always know if I'm pronouncing that right, but anosmia is a loss of smell, and ageusia is loss of taste. So both of these had sensitivities below 50%, but specificities over 90%, which means it was fairly bad at predicting the presence of COVID, essentially, and it couldn't be used as like an indicator of COVID. So yeah, basically these were the results from the study, and the author does also go on to say, as we also pretty much gathered from the data, that many of the signs and symptoms do have low diagnostic accuracy, and also since some studies had high risk of bias and other potential concerns, this doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. But overall, the symptoms weren't very good at actually predicting the presence of COVID. And they say that it isn't accurate enough to rule in or out COVID-19. But they do say that the presence of anosmia or ageusia may be useful as a red flag, and fever and cough, given their high sensitivities, may also be useful to identify people for further testing. So yeah, that's how I essentially interpreted the data as well. So it's good that our conclusion does match up with the author's conclusion as well. And what I actually liked a lot about the site called Cochrane Library, I found this on this article and on a couple of other articles. I don't know if they do this for all of their articles though, so I will have to check. But in this at least, they included a plain language summary. So if it's a little bit hard to get through all like the scientific jargon, then you could also go to the plain language summary, and it has a lot of the same information there. So for example, this is essentially what we covered in the abstract, all the included studies, the main results, the objective here, that's what this was, and then the conclusions. So it includes a lot of the same information, though of course some things are simplified, some details are left out, but I think it's useful at least to kind of compare and contrast the original version with the plain language summary, because it did at least help me to better understand it. So yeah, just use all the resources that are available to you. And I will link this article in the description as well if you want to check it out. And yeah, I hope you join me in the next video. Remember to like and subscribe, and stay curious.